if you will, there's general principles that we talked about, and those general principles apply to situations we didn't talk about. There's this, oh, I've got this outcome versus that outcome. I'm thinking about this or that. I am 99% sure that the general principles we talked about will apply to the situations and the specific examples that we didn't talk about, because those are the things that you're always trying to go back to. It's like, I need to think ahead to my client. I need to think ahead to their goals, the overall job. I need to think ahead to the customer and meaning the job executor and their knowledge and their understanding of things and the validity of ratings from different perspectives, whether it be the positive, negative, whether it be their level of knowledge and expertise. Those are the principles that I'm always going to come back to. And so I think the discussion did a really good job of getting at the principles of thinking through situations, even those that we didn't talk about.
I'm actually going to wander into our next topic a little bit, but just because I think it's very similar to this, and I don't know that it's a completely different discussion. I'm going to read the next one and then tell me if this is this the exact same thing, or is there a nuance here? And I called this one root cause levels. And for the scenario, imagine you're interviewing a surgeon, and you just particular surgery. You ask the surgeon, what's the challenges you have with this particular surgery, and they say these patients are at a risk of sepsis. Okay, that's bad. You probe what contributes to the sepsis, and there's many things contribute to it, but mainly bacteria is introduced into the blood when our instruments are not properly sanitized. Now, there's a whole handful of potential outcomes. That's why I'll go there, because I think it's very similar to our discussion. You could stay at the top level, minimize the likelihood of sepsis. You could go to that root cause, minimize the likelihood of introducing bacteria into the blood, where you don't mention sepsis now, or you can pull them together, minimize the likelihood of sepsis due to introduction of bacteria into the blood, or you could go to the next level root cause, minimize, and your statement's getting longer, minimize the likelihood of sepsis due to introduction of bacteria in the blood from improperly sanitized instruments, or just go straight to the main root cause, minimize the likelihood of improperly sanitized instruments. Now, I know this is a familiar scenario, maybe not the exact one, but this levels of root cause, and I went straight there because it seemed like it just flowed from what we were already talking. And I don't know, have we pretty much nailed this one, or what else is there to consider when trying to determine that right level of high level versus the root cause? It's really the same discussion, isn't it?
I do see a difference, though.
Okay.
You could actually use this as an entry point to framing the job to begin with. Because while it is true that in almost any surgical procedure, you want to minimize the likelihood that sepsis occurs, sepsis is such a big problem, not only in terms of life and death, but in terms of health economics. It's absolutely huge. You can actually treat that as a job domain that has rough job phases of you want to prevent it and you want to detect it. And when it happens, you want to respond appropriately and monitor post-response outcomes. Like, that's its own job map with very detailed outcomes at each step. So I actually wonder if in part this is a framing question for the entire job.
It could be a level lower, though. Maybe my example is too high sepsis. Think about bladder infections. If I said because that's something you would not have with everything, right? Minimize likelihood of bladder infections. What your fear would be is if you stayed at the bladder infection level and you get some score on that, but maybe there's all these different root causes. I think you're back to the different types of nematodes. But my greater fear would be going all the way to the bottom. Minimize the likelihood of improperly sanitized instruments, and whoever's taking it's not making the connection to this causes bladder infections. Does that make sense?
I just want to make a kind of comment that's not completely related to this particular question here, but in the sense that I feel that a lot of the issues we're discussing are also connected, in addition to mixing up the solution space with the problem space. They're also related to this notion that they are generated by external events. And I wonder to which extent this it doesn't really have a space attributed to it in the jobs to be done, but things that are provoked by something in your environment. So the first example we talked about, rain. This is something out of the control of the farmer. Here we're talking about sepsis, which is also some event happening. And of course, there's an infinity of events that can happen in the world, you know. I mean, sepsis is one of them. There are other things, but I don't really have any solution. I'm just noticing that is kind of a challenge. As soon as you start talking about avoiding stuff coming in from the outside, you're going to have a bit of a problem. And I quite like this distinction between achieve goals and maintain goals, which it's a bit of a different kind of vocabulary, but there's this notion of you want a goal that's to maintain a certain state of affairs, and then there's an achieve goal where you want to change the state of affairs. Anyway, just made me think of this as we're talking about these different problems.
Scott, I think one of the reasons why this outcome is so interesting is because we could talk about the technical content of it in terms of like the disease state and the disease mechanics of sepsis, right? That's interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
But there is this idea of root cause, sepsis caused by X, Y, and Z reasons. But there's also a recognition that any outcome, in a sense, can become almost like a fractal. The reason why I raise this possibility is that a healthcare company that I know of was founded specifically because the founder's mother died from sepsis. And the brief story of it was that she was sent home post-surgery. The physician instructed her to monitor her vital signs through heart rate and blood pressure cuffs all through home. And she religiously documented her symptoms and her health readings. And over the course of 3 weeks, this is after they found that she had passed away in her home, they found all the clinical signs that sepsis was setting in, but the doctors never knew it because it was written down with pen and paper. So he created a whole company to solve this with remote patient monitoring. Now, all that insight and detail that led to the founding and creation of a new company that's gaining traction in the market came from just focusing on a single outcome, in a sense, minimize the likelihood of sepsis. But it didn't come from focusing on the root causes of it. It came almost by applying ODI just to that one outcome. And so I think you're right. There is this root cause discussion that's really interesting within the context of a broader study for a certain job. But there's also this idea of, oh, you can go deep and lateral on a single outcome sometimes.
I think this is Scott I'll plug your book. So Scott describes this nicely in the book. I think if you look at it, and you just mentioned this, minimize the likelihood of sepsis is a job on its own.
Sure.
I mean, it fits the definition perfectly. You can break it down into a map. Why not? So, and then you get this fractality where things get messy. But well, that's just
It just means we need a second study sometimes. Sometimes the answer that something is an opportunity means there's more to learn and discover.
Yeah. I love that, Eric. And you know, and even what Jan was suggesting before about, you know, was keep I realize we're going back and forth with these different examples. Hope we're not losing anybody. But with the minimized likelihood of damage due to pests or whatever, maybe it needs to stay at that, because basically, Jan, you were suggesting a mini study within it. But maybe we're just trying to often do too much with one. You know, you keep it at a high level. Maybe you can even have a somewhat smaller sample, and then you go back in a little bit more targeted way. I don't know, but maybe that's part of it's sort of part of the our environment. We're not even really we're not acknowledging until you just did, Eric, is that we've got this constraint of we're doing one quantitative study, and that's just sort of part of the environment we're talking about. And we're not saying it until you just did, is that all of this, you know, we could get to whatever level with multiple studies, and of course there's a cost with that. But hey, man, how much is it? what's the cost of solving some of these problems? What's the cost of launching crappy products? You know, I mean, it's so that's a case we've often made, and so, you know, maybe that should be a ongoing conversation as we get, because, you know, when we're studying a market, to this, I love this thought of fractal. It's a very visual way of thinking of a hierarchy of different levels. So I love that word and that thinking. But so if a project's scoped at a very broad level, man, that means there's also lots more details. There's lots more root causes, and to some degree, the project. So I've touched down. If that sort of necessitates whether it should be a second study. If I'm not going to say it's too high, but if it's at the level, so there's another constraint, which is a person's ability, energy to take a survey. Otherwise, you could just give them this massive 5-hour thing. So anyway, I think there's these constraints that we should just acknowledge them and say, hey, within this constraint, we can get a certain amount of information. If we live this constraint, meaning we do a couple studies or whatever. Yeah. And probably the thing, I'll be a little heretical here. Survey length, I'll just say this is something we should be careful about. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yes. And isn't this also somehow related to the feasibility discussion? So of course, when you're doing these jobs to be done studies, you also have to put a frame on them, because as we've discussed, you can go up or down to infinity. So part of the job is to actually frame the right level, etc. And that, I guess, is informed by different things, namely, if your company has the capability of building something. So maybe if you're, you know, a chemical company, you could figure out some formula to sanitize the instruments, but maybe you couldn't. So that maybe would be the right level, but maybe some other level you couldn't address because you just don't have the expertise.
It definitely depends on what your capabilities are and are interested in, and what the company's strategy is. That should always be relevant. I'm going to keep us moving on here. Jan, I wonder if you could talk to us about this nuances.
Yeah, well, I think we kind of have been talking about it the whole time. So maybe I just I want to use your examples and maybe mine also just to emphasize it. I think this is it's kind of maybe a different perspective on the same problem. I mean, you probably end up either from different interviews or from different ways of trying to work these out, just with outcomes that are just different. Not different in the sense of level, maybe not different. Maybe that's the distinction here. So it's not a like a nesting problem. One is kind of more abstract or more general rather than the other, but it's super close to one another, and it's just a nuance of formulating it. And I imagine that it's not so. So I wrote down what did I? So like I took I think Scott, you had this example of getting kids to take their vitamins every morning, and you could phrase it in different ways, right? So you could say minimize the time it takes to get a child to take their vitamins, or you could say minimize the time it takes until a child is willing to take their vitamins. Now that it introduces a difference, so it changes the meaning ever so slightly. Or you could say minimize the number of mornings when it's a challenge to get a child to take their vitamins, or some variation of that. So I don't think this is a like an abstraction level or like a level problem, but like every word adds something or changes the meaning in some sense. And I think, I mean, just maybe also to make this clear to the audience, I think this is extremely important because down the road, that influences what kind of solutions you're thinking about. It influences what words you might be using in your marketing. So this is not just, well, it's also 5 guys obsessing about language, but it's not irrelevant. I think it's really relevant in the whole process, because I mean, if you then take that statement and put it in front of an engineer, every word matters. If you put it in front of a customer, every word matters. So just yeah. But how do you deal with these? I don't know. You have 5 variations, and they are all kind of the same. Like, how to go about the decision?
I just noticed something, Jan. The subject of each statement is different. In other words, there's the hint of a presumption of a solution. Minimize the time it takes to get a child is an outside actor trying to influence the child. Minimize the time it takes until a child is willing makes the child the subject. So now we're talking about what the role is in the solution.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. It has a profound implication on solutioning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't have a, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, Scott. First of all, I'm thinking that the title of this you need to go back to what Jan was saying there about five guys, something about, nuance.
Five guys obsessing about language.
Obsessing about the nuance of language. That should be like the title for it.
That's
right?
Good.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Every situation's different. So I'm going to make some comments on the examples that Jan had laid out here for us, that I guess might convey a bigger principle that I would apply, but I'd have to apply it in a specific situation. So first of all, I agree with Jan that this is a different situation. And Scott, I'm glad you brought this one up, because in the others, we've dealt with whether something's a solution or not a solution. We've dealt with something, whether, levels of abstraction and what you do with that and what the good and the bad of it is. I do think that Jan's right, that this is more of nuances of language. And so that's how we titled it. I think it's good. So my comment on this one, when I was just jotting down my own notes on it, was first thing I want to figure out is whether these really are just nuances of difference. I mean, are we really just talking about nuances of difference? Or are we really talking about something different? I mean, the first one he'd written down was the time it takes to get a child to take their vitamins. And first of all, I'm not going to comment on what Eric talked about. I actually think what Eric talked about is very important, is whether we're still in the solution space here or not. But for the moment, just looking at it is, all right, the time it takes to get a child to take their vitamins. Okay. And the second one and the third one both dealt with motivation, though. The time it takes until a child is willing to take their vitamins. Okay. So that's part of the challenge of the time, is the willingness. And so maybe if that's really the main reason why it takes time is the unwillingness, then I need to have that in there. So part of it is just understanding more about the detail of why does it take time. And hopefully through my interviews, I've gotten that sense of understanding. The third one, which I don't know that Jan read, was the number of mornings when it's a challenge to get their child or your child to take their vitamins. Again, we're talking about motivation here. So first of all, when I'm just looking at these three, and these might have been those sub points that I would have, is like, are these better? Are they different? These are the ones that I might be struggling with. And I want to step back and be like, well, first of all, why did I put them together even? Why am I tying these together? What is the common element here? And although motivation is not stated in the first one, I think motivation is part of the first one. Because why does it take the parent, why does it take them time to get their child to take vitamins? Is it about the swallowing? Okay, if so, that's a whole separate thing. But if part of that was, well, it's because they get resistance from the child, it's not stated, but it's implied. Well, then that's actually a bad thing, because I don't want to have implied reasons for things, because then someone's not going to get that when I'm doing it. I want to go direct to the heart of the issue. And if motivation or resistance from the child is really the essence of what we're getting at here, it's not even so much a nuance. It's actually just getting at the heart of what the issue is. Why did Jan put these three things together here? He thought they were related, and they were probably related in discussion, if nothing else. But I think that there's something underlying them that makes them related. It's just not stated in number one. I think it's motivation. If motivation is ultimately what ties them together, then the nuance I need to make sure I have in my actual outcome statement is, I need to have something that gets at actual motivation. If there are reasons for resistance beyond this, and there's choking issues and there's other things, I might need to deal with that separately. But for the moment of dealing with these, I need to make sure that I have an outcome that gets at motivation. And honestly, then I have the question of, is it time? From the parent's perspective, it's time in some ways, but it's time because of the issue of motivation. And so honestly, my ultimate outcome here that might be better, that captures the time element and also the motivation element, might be something along the lines of minimize the likelihood that the child, my child, again, I might use pronouns here, not because it's not the child, it's my child. Minimize the likelihood that my child is unmotivated to take their vitamins, or minimize the amount of resistance from my child in taking their vitamins. I need to step back and ask myself, what's the real issue here that ties these things together? What's the real outcome that we're trying to satisfy? What's the real challenge and concern from the parent perspective? And I didn't do this study, but even when I'm looking at these three outcomes, I'm thinking it's motivation, and I want to make sure I get at the heart of that issue and make sure that's the focus for my outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So I mean, this is it's a made up example, but I completely see your point. So I mean, minimize the time it takes to get a child to take their vitamins. It has unspelled out implications that are kind of avoiding what you really want to get at, and that matters tremendously, because it as I said before, it changes, or Eric said it as well, it changes solutioning. It changes what problem are you going after with your solution is tremendously different, whether it's about swallowing or the child, or it's about, I don't know, the difficulty to get the vitamins from somewhere to, so it has profound implications.
Right.
I like that. Yeah.
5 guys obsessed about wing.
It's just going to keep coming up, isn't it? I'm telling you, it's the perfect title.
It is.
You know, Scott, Jan did promise earlier in our pre-conversation that he would talk about his child. So here it comes.
There we go.
Right. Well, at the moment, it's quite, I mean, at the moment, the resistance is not a problem. I mean, that's very easy. I think I probably sometime down the road, that's going to change. But at the moment, I'm good.
Oh man, my youngest lives off of turkey hot dogs and potato chips. She doesn't eat anything else. So whatever she'll eat, we're not worried about junk food. Just get the calories in there. It's not the same situation with me, but you know, just an observation, and we're not gonna get to all our things we knew we weren't going to, but just I've been sort of reading ahead a little bit, you know, trying to figure out what next topic we might put in, and it's striking that so many of our conversations really there's a lot of the same themes that are going through to address all of them, which is not something that was obvious to me. But I want to hit one that I see is a bit different, and then maybe we'll sort of tie this together. And it's Eric, it's one of yours, and you called it overlook the problem of overlooking the context of use. I think that's maybe a bit fresh. Walk us through that situation.
Oh, that's so interesting, because my instinct was actually to go to Jan's on positive versus negatives, but
okay, I tell you what, we'll hit both of those before we
direction.
Yeah, because I think that's a useful one to talk about as well.
All right, that'll be our final 2. Great. Let's do your context, then we'll do positives and negatives, and then wrap up.
Well, I wanted to highlight this problem that I sometimes see, is that outcomes can be developed without considering the broader context in which the product or service is being used. And I think as practitioners and innovators and people who really want to understand what's the truth might be, is we want to ensure that our outcome statements capture that context and all the relevant factors that could affect the customer experience. And so sometimes this arises when a customer responds to a question with, well, I need a better solution, or I'm seeking this benefit or this feature or this service. And so it has this aspect of, well, what is the context? So Scott, I don't know, did any one of the 3 examples I offered, did they capture your attention more than others?
I was reading through them. I'll tell you, I'll tell you one that occurred to me, and it's an example I use when talking about context a lot. And you know, if you're planning a trip, if you want to understand challenges, planning a trip to Disney World, okay? And let's say you're sort of sloppy about your sample design. You take whoever you can get. Well, so I'm gonna say your challenges will have, if you live in Orlando versus if you live in Arizona, you can have some unique needs. And if you're driving versus flying, if you're a group of adults versus you have young children versus you have a 3-month-old versus you have teenagers, all those contexts, I mean, it's malpractice to not think, and that's just one thing. I've mentioned a couple. I mentioned like how many people, you know, the children and sort of where you live, just as two things, and we could come up with a bunch more. I don't know. I usually bring that up when talking about building samples, like the error you would make, and something you don't think about. What are we trying to do with a sample design? We're trying to learn the most from the fewest people possible. And the way we do that is to make sure we have all these contexts taken into account. Or if you did a qualitative with 100 people and there was no variability in context, you're fooling yourself. And I see this as a problem in B2B because often it's traditional just to interview who your good customers are. You know, And so you're fooling yourself a bit. Now, is that sort of what you were thinking of? Is that, or did I go a different direction?
No, look at it this way. You want to go to Disney World with your family, and so do I. We both want to minimize the time it takes to get there.
Sure.
Because, I mean, unless you like road trips or flying. Scott, how many hours would it take you to drive from North Carolina to Disney World?
About 9.
It would take me 2 days at least.
Yeah, you should go to Disneyland instead, but yeah, from where you are.
Your context of minimize the time it takes being an opportunity is completely different than mine. And so there's this something I've acknowledged or realized is that need statements without a benchmark. For example, how long does it take you, Scott? How long does it take me? Lance, how long would it take you from Texas? Like that benchmark makes a big difference. And so in other words, there's other information beyond the need statement that is useful to gather to provide the innovator context to better solving it.
Yeah.
So wholeheartedly agree that sometimes we need the context for the client to understand the challenges that the customer faces. Scott, to your point, I think sometimes we need to make sure that our sample covers context. I definitely think in the interviewing phase, sometimes there's an outcome that applies to multiple contexts, and it could be rated maybe by context in the survey or whatever, but there's an outcome that relates to multiple contexts, but it may not come up if you talk about a general situation. You talk about specific context, like in a surgical context of different patient sizes, for example, different patient ages, different comorbidities, that there are outcomes that someone thinks about and have become a challenge or important in this context or not that. So it's useful for interviewing. But beyond that, I want to draw attention to one of the examples that Eric brought up, because I think this one's different from all of that as well. One of the ones that Eric mentioned was the example he gave as being the after the better one was in a user interface environment, consumer. It's the last one I use. It says minimize the likelihood of being unable to read the display outdoors on a bright sunny day. The context there is the outdoors on a bright sunny day. And so you could end that outcome with, if we're talking about a user interface context here, we've got some sort of display. So that's sort of the assumed environment. You could say minimize the likelihood of being unable to read the display in there. If people are thinking about this in a general context, maybe it's very important, but probably very well satisfied. I mean, I can look at my display right now and it's very easy to read, but completely different satisfaction levels if we're talking about on outdoors on a bright sunny day. And so the context there hugely matters to whether the outcome is potentially important, but certainly satisfied here. And it's one where, well, Scott, while I wholeheartedly agree with you that there are times where I want to structure my sample for context, and I've done that in medical context. It's a primary procedure, it's a revision procedure, huge variations there. It's an older patient, it's a younger patient, it's an obese patient, it's a non-obese patient. I think those are big contexts where I can get sample that is, I can have 150 rate in this context, 150 in this context, and I don't have to have the statements rated differently in that case. The statements can be the same, but I say to everyone, you think about this in this context or that context, and that takes care of it. But I think there are other situations like the one Eric has mentioned here where I could have a sample that's just doing the interface outdoors, bright sunny day. So maybe that is a possibility. But maybe that only applies to 3 outcomes. And all the other outcomes, it's really not about that. So I'm not sure I want to waste my sample, honestly, on having 150 people rated in that one context. There's really only 3 outcomes that might be impacted by that. And maybe there's only one type of context where this is really even important. And so in that case, I need to understand the context, because I actually want to write 2 or 3 outcomes that are just specific to that context. And then the question is, well, do I have obsessing about language? Do I have other outcomes that say nothing, or say in a general indoor environment? I have to think through that separately. But the point here is that I think there are times where, and this actually goes back to the one Jan had earlier mentioned about, what do we call that one? I guess it was the optimal, where we have context. Sometimes you need the context. in the actual outcome statement to really get the essence of when this is a challenge, why is it a challenge. And so in this case, if I can only have a couple of outcomes that specify where the real challenge is in that context, now there'll be other contexts here as well, then it's worth the survey space to have these in there, because it's what's really going to resonate with the customer. It's when they really have the challenge, and it's really going to best guide my client if they see the opportunity here to know that context in the actual outcome statement. So again, I just think that's different from the other examples we were going through. I think those are also important, but I also think sometimes we just need an outcome that states the context as well for all the different objectives we've been talking about, from a customer rating perspective, from a client innovation goal perspective as well.
Yeah. I don't know what I can add to that. I mean, but I'll repeat. I have this habit of repeating things. It's almost like I'm just internalizing.
What a good moderator does, Scott.
humor me. Yeah, but I mean, it's similar to the root cause thing in that it could create, instead of one statement, you have 7 or 8, but instead of 7 or 8 root causes, now you have 7 or 8 contexts. And then, so I think you just sort of have to, I mean, so what do I do? What do we do in practice? Sometimes you take a few contexts that are sort of similar. I mean, this is you're trying to get your number of statements down, and you sort of, these 3 things are sort of similar. So you group those as one strategy. But, if you think about, we talk, a common example when jobs we've done is preparing a meal. What's preparing a meal? Well, think about preparing a meal at home versus preparing a meal while tailgating for a football game versus preparing a meal, I mean, I don't know, at somebody else's house or whatever, or while camping. Those drastically change everything. So you would want to call out those contexts, and then maybe there's different studies.
Well, or to the point Eric offered earlier on the sepsis example, right? On those, we literally are now talking about different jobs, because the job itself could have the context stated in it. Right. And then to your point, there's such different challenges, not just at one point in that process, but take the camping one versus at home. We've potentially got contextual impact and different impact on the entire job process. The interesting thing here is that the outcomes might actually be largely the same, but we need context across the entire thing. Then again, it comes back to, where's our client trying to innovate? On the one hand, they might be entirely about camping goods, and so in that case, we only need the one context. We just need to make sure that that's our context for our interviews, for the survey ratings, et cetera. But interestingly enough, we dealt with that client before in a different area of the company, and they were dealing with making cooking supplies for the home. We may actually have the outcomes already that apply to both contexts. It's just the contextual variation of ratings that really make it different. To the point, though, Scott, of whether, again, there's still this issue of level of detail here that we still have to deal with. Display outdoors on a bright, sunny day. Well, I could have outdoors on a cloudy day. I could have outdoors on okay, so we have that. But even more than that, I could say minimize likelihood of being unable to read the display outdoors on a bright, sunny day while driving, with the sun coming through the driver's side window at a 45-degree angle, with trees and occasional shade on my, right? Yeah. Obviously, you get to some level of ridiculousness, and it's obviously ridiculous at this point. It's not ridiculous at this point, but we still got the truth might lie somewhere in between those things, where we've got no context, we've got ridiculous level of context, and do we go with the no context? Does that impact your ratings? Does that impact the innovation goal, or is one level below that? There is a point, Scott, where we want to say, oh, no judgment, just put context in there, and there should be no judgment of us as practitioners. That's not realistically the case. We always have some level of judgment in there relative to client objectives, relative to client or the customer survey ratings, and what we think is going to be valid and useful, and it will make sense, and they'll understand it from their perspective. We do have to put our expertise on that based on the interviews that we've done, based on our understanding of the client situation. And again, I don't know that I think that the level I gave was ridiculous, but maybe Eric's example here is too detailed. Maybe it's not detailed enough. I think it's something that we have to have a discussion.
I go back to one of the first things you said when we opened this up. when it was, I think it was more about root causes, but essentially during the discussion, uncover all that with the I mean, you have to get all the detail, and then later you can make a decision to abstract up or combine things if you choose to. But if you don't have all the context, if you haven't pushed for all of that, you probably you have an incomplete picture, and even worse, you have an incomplete picture and you're not aware of it.
True.
Yeah.
What is that, Sky? You did training way back when, right? There's the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns. There's that, right? And which one do you
Donald
really
Rumsfeld. There's known knowns, unknown unknowns, and then I don't know. Look it up, folks. Donald Rumsfeld quote. Yeah.
To the point of being more aware, there's another aspect of this that relates to jobs that take potentially years or more to get done from end to end. So imagine a long-running chronic disease, where the diagnosis might happen, and yet the physician is still treating and managing that 4 years later.
Right.
And now you present your very carefully gathered need statements to the physician.
Yeah.
Do you either A, ask, for the last patient case you treated, how important and satisfied were these needs related to diagnosis that happened 4 years ago? And then you get to the next part of the job map where it's managing, which it is in their current and in their memory. Or do you say, well, the last time you diagnosed, which could have been yesterday, but it was for patient A, but then when was the last time you helped a patient in a treatment part, and that could have been with patient Z. Like, there's this context choice that we have in having people rate outcomes that we must also be aware of, because if we don't set it, then the respondent may switch it on us and we would never know.
You know, we've basically been talking about qualitative for the most part, but I think we could have an equally engaging but different conversation on how to deal with the complexities within quantitative. And just like you described, like I mean, the sepsis example or whatever, you know, medical is a good one because these often are things that you manage different, like in Lance mentioned comorbidities. There's all these different situations that will make a physician rate things totally differently. So that when my head blows up a little bit that I have to admit, it's because I'm itching beyond my core expertise. That's why I have you guys to ask questions on. But it's yeah. All right, let's get that positive and negative one, and then Jan, frame that up. And I've got thoughts on it, but frame that one up for us. You probably know my thoughts already.
I'm not trying to. Okay, so I'll maybe the examples aren't ideal, but it's I'm probably poking to a nest here. That's why I put it in there as an example. So maybe I'll just say a little bit where it's coming from. So the example is about positives and negatives, and it came because I always, so with my partner that I often do interviews with, Beat, I always have a tendency to do double negatives and all, because I don't find them difficult to understand, but it's super hard. No one, I mean, I understand it, but no one else. So and then and he always changes this into more like a positive variation of the statement. And this got me thinking into this question of, I mean, you can kind of describe sometimes, and that's probably a discussion in itself, but I think you can describe the same, or you can say it's kind of the outcome is about the same thing, but it's a positive formulation and the other one is a negative formulation. And it's just almost like two sides of the same coin kind of thing. So I have illustrative examples. They're not probably, maybe if you word it differently, it comes out the other way, but I hope you see what I mean. So you could say, for example, that as rarely as possible, a daily maintenance round is prolonged by unexpected problems. Something like that. So maybe that violates a whole lot of rules, but I think you get what I'm going at. Or you could phrase it the other way around and say that as often as possible, the daily maintenance is completed without any unexpected problems. So which is somehow, at least it feels to me like that's, I mean, come on, that's the same thing. It's just, right? So it's one thing is avoiding it. And then anyway, okay. So now here's probably the discussion worthy part as well. I don't think the negative one is always the best choice. I don't think we should always also start with to minimize. I think, Lance, you hinted a couple of times at that as well, that our situation kind of where you deviate from this. But yeah, so how do you deal deal with that, or do you don't even? I mean, that could be an option. You don't even believe that that's two sides of the same coin. I would just want all of your perspectives on that.
So I'll start with my general perspective, and we can talk about this specific example. I've got thoughts on that as well. But my general perspective is, certainly you already heard from me earlier, I agree that there are times where increase might make the most sense. And sometimes that is just due to clarity of language. Double negatives can be confusing. I mean, especially when you say something like minimize the likelihood of not doing, I mean, there's just sometimes it's that, and sometimes but on the other hand, the example we gave earlier, you could say minimize the likelihood that my child is not motivated, or you could say minimize the likelihood that my child is unmotivated. Sometimes just putting a different word in there for the other negative you're trying to avoid actually helps with that. Because at the end of the day, we are trying to put out statements that help the client, that could resonate in a survey, that the person doing the ratings will actually understand, going back to Eric's perspective earlier of reading these things out loud, making sure that you've got the client actually engaging with these things to make sure they make sense, that they're clear. So that's certainly the case. And so sometimes I think we simply need a switch in increase versus minimize, because it really does help with the language. And I think we need that. Tony's perspective, generally speaking, has been minimize, 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 minimize. And one of the goals there is to have consistency. I do think that I've done enough ratings and surveys, not just in ODI, but other situations where when you have something, best practice in academia is to have some things rated positively worded, some things negatively rated as part of the same scale. And from a pure research survey perspective, I can tell you that if you do a factor analysis on those things, more often than not, the positives load together, the negatives load together. What that tells me is it's not that the positives and negatives actually should have been combined, but what's happening is that it actually is impacting customer ratings. And so I do think that just pragmatically, validity-wise, there's a benefit of keeping it as consistent as possible. Okay, but we can't always do that. And so I'm okay with that as well. But beyond that, I will say that sometimes there's client pushback, and I've done training sessions where people are pushing back and they want more minimize, more increase. They want this mixture of things. But I truly believe that in practice, and I've done a lot of training on this where I will tell people, I truly believe in practice, minimize more often than not is the proper lead-in, because I truly believe that people will say things like, I increase the likelihood of perfection in the whatever I'm doing. Well, what does that mean? Perfection is usually measured as the absence of problems. And certainly from a time perspective, the perfection in time is to minimize the time. Cost perfection is to minimize the cost. And usually on some quality measure, it's to take out the variation, it's to take out the problems, it's to take out the redundancies and things like that. And so more often than not, I really believe that it is minimized. We can come back to the specific example we had here and how I might address that. But for a moment, I'm going to put that out there and get others to comment on that.
One of my favorite researchers is Daniel Kahneman. And he has a couple of really profound books, Thinking Fast and Slow and Noise, both repay steady. And he provides very convincing, compelling, big evidence that framing effects, positive framing versus negative framing, results in very different choices by people. And one of the examples I recall is he said, if you frame a surgical procedure as causing death 10% of the time, or if you frame it as having positive outcomes 90% of the time, the choice that physicians make differs radically. And these are some of the smartest, best educated people in the world, and they're still influenced by framing effects. And so I think the default rule that Tony advises has validity. Like, have a consistent framing throughout your entire study. I think that makes sense. But I think there's also the possibility of wanting to discover which framing actually resonates with customers more. And I remember this case study that Tony and Stratogen has related to a company called Coloplast. And that case study may still be downloadable, but it had this framing element. If I remember correctly, the context was nurses treating patients with these diabetic ulcerated wounds. In other words, they're wounds that never quite really heal.
Yeah.
And 𝗂𝗏 at that time was conveying to the market, hey, this promotes wound healing or accelerates healing, something to that effect. But the actual unmet needs and opportunities were all around preventing infection or complications as a result of using the wound dressing. So in a sense, it's that positive or negative framing. But when 𝗂𝗏 didn't change the product, they just changed what they messaged to. They had this huge lift in sales. And so if there's room to do it, I would maybe invite the possibility of testing both framings.
Yeah.
Really? So you would have like all positive and then all negative as a survey taken?
That almost sounds like doubling the length of the survey, but I know that's not what you mean. But I think sometimes you want to test both the negative and positive framing, because if one is a greater opportunity, that might signal it's going to resonate more from a marketing and messaging perspective, even though the value proposition of our product is still the same.
I was just trying to clarify what I thought you were saying. I think I must have gotten it wrong, though. I thought you were saying like you would do one survey where they're all negative statements, another survey where they're all positive statements. Then you would have somebody would have the data analysis nightmare of linking them. Probably that's not what you're suggesting. Then.
Oh no, same survey, just in a sense duplicating the concepts, but one statement is the negative framing, the other statement is the positive framing.
So that would double the survey then, right?
Or just on one of a set of outcomes, maybe 2 or 3 or something like that. So
just on 2 or 3.
That's how I understood it. You say so.
Yeah. Well, wow. I certainly learned something there. I was not aware that it had that biasing of impact. So that's really good to know. So I have to absorb that. But while I'm absorbing it, I'll tell you what I would have told you without that information. That first of all, I believe philosophically, I think Tony has it right in that somebody wants to accomplish something and help them do that better. You remove everything that's going wrong. So even if I write a statement that's like minimize the likelihood, let's say, so you minimize the likelihood. So we had nutrition, minimize the likelihood of your child getting inadequate nutrition. I believe actually that's really what it is. Which is not the same thing as that's what the word should be, but that's actually what it is. I want to take this problem away, but I would be okay with saying, well, I'll go to what sort of my latest thing, but in traditional ODI language, you could translate, at least prior to 10 years ago or so, you could, instead of minimize the likelihood your child gets inadequate nutrition, increase the likelihood your child gets adequate nutrition. Now, in my own personal thinking, my need statements, outcome statements are what you would probably call a job statement. So instead of minimize the likelihood, I personally will use prevent, or enable, determine. So I'm not sure to what degree that gets me around that problem or not, but here's my logic, for better or worse, is that first determine what it actually really is, in which so minimize regardless of wording, minimize the likelihood that your child gets inadequate nutrition. And then I think of another readability fact. Okay, how can I make that statement? Even if I lose a bit of the meaning, even if not a lot, but I'll give up 5% of the precision for quicker recognition. That's just easier to read. Right or wrong, that's sort of where my own personal philosophy has been, just to like have the outcome statement in a traditional sense, and then okay, how can I make this readable? Absolutely readable, and also have value being concise, but I'm not going crazy with that. I don't know if that's an overly complicated answer, but
I think to the question here, then, I mean, I think first of all, outcomes can get so unwieldy and long and so complicated that someone loses the essence of what you're talking about. That can be a problem, so we want to avoid that. So I think, and sometimes we can just create simpler, they're still outcome statements, they still have all the structure, but the object of control goes to 5 words when it was 10 words, and really the 10 words were unnecessary. And so I think sometimes it's always a benefit of looking at it that way and thinking about simplifying these and making sure it's very clear, things again that Eric was talking about earlier. But if we're simplifying and we're changing that frame of reference to what Eric was sharing, and I was as well, but Eric, I love his perspective on that. We do have to caution there, because now you could actually be impacting the validity of the ratings as well. If you've got some that you've simplified and phrased positive and some that you've simplified and kept negative, it could actually be impacting the how much it resonates with someone. And we want to watch out for that. To your original point, Scott, is generally believing that Tony's got it right on the minimize and taking that out. And you even said on this one, I feel like the person is trying to prevent the inadequate nutrition. Well, if that's really what you think and what you've heard that they really are trying to get at, and we think there's consistency and benefit of the negatives, then I would want to simplify and maintain that other goal as much as possible while maintaining that negative, meaning the minimize, avoid, prevent frame of reference, because I really do believe that it could impact things. And so going back to the example that Jan had shared here, he had said, on the negative side, that as rarely as possible, a daily maintenance round is prolonged by unexpected problems. And on a positive side, that as often as possible, the daily maintenance round is completed without any expected problems. Honestly, all I saw in both cases was avoid unexpected problems. And so that actually was the commonality of both of them. And so my statement was minimize the likelihood that the daily maintenance round has unexpected problems. That's really what I'm trying to get at in both cases. Simpler. Yeah. And so in both cases, I'm trying to get at the essence of what someone is concerned about. Positive, negative, that's actually what held them both together. I lean toward the minimize side. It actually is a double negative, the minimize and avoid problems, but it's unexpected problems helps me to deal with that and ideally put the language in a way that helps the customer. I think the minimize generally is the rule, generally is where we need to be, and then as simple of language that the customer can understand that the client can work with.
Yeah, that's so nice. Yeah. So you see, this is the beauty of these discussions. Now we should go into a discussion of 2 or 3 hours about what's perfection. And then
now for our next 2 hours, we're going to talk about the quantitative side. Well, I tell you what I've tried to do is we've gone through all these, and we'll see if how well I can read my own notes. But just to sort of capture some general principles, because just early on, it was clear, wow, there's themes going through what I imagined, all these different scenarios. But again, it's my own scribble scrabble, as my kids would say. So I've got 11 points here, in no order at all. So I would title this "How to Obsess over Language in an Excellent Way so you have amazing outcome statements." So number one, use a partner. If you're doing a project, use a partner. Have somebody you can read things back to, even just read them out loud to, sort of hold each other accountable. Rules are good for guardrails, but they were not handed down on tablets on 10 Commandments. So really try to use them, but also if you really, there can be compelling reasons to break them. Like you're not supposed to put "and" in a statement. I've found situations where I do that. Within qualitative, now this really was a theme. Embrace this divergent phase. Like, we're not applying judgment. Get all the detail you can. Get all the root causes you can. Get all the context you can. And really have the patience within this divergent phase to get everything that you need. And as Eric has taught me many times, with the customer, keep reframing. What is it they want to accomplish? What is it they are really trying to do? Sort of keep that in mind, and don't be afraid to continually go up. We all sort of, it's interesting, use this visual thinking. It's not necessarily up or down, but we think of up as like the broader thing we want to accomplish, and down for root causes, and then I sort of think left and right for context, but I don't know where that comes from. But it seems like we're sort of similar there. Let's see. Exploring solutions in your statement. It sort of goes back to that rules. There are times for it, but you really want to question that. You want to avoid having outcome statements outside of what anybody can control, such as the weather, for example. The use of you in a statement. Be careful, because that could be a solution. That could be part of the solution if you're using that. So, but not to say it would never occur, but be careful about that. When you're writing, you only write, or I should say, write outcomes at the level of experience that your job executors have. So if you're calling out a root cause and you're expecting them to understand what bigger problems that causes, then that's good. But you don't want. But Lance, your example about mechanical failures of the car is a great one. I mean, there's lots of people would not, including me, would not be able to associate some root cause with whatever's going wrong with my car. read your outcomes out loud. And now I'll wrap up with this one, is that jobs to be done and outcomes itself is a solution. It's a solution to helping somebody get something done better. And so if we should understand anything, if we don't get that point, then we need to go back and we need to read some Lance Bettencourt and Tony Owick and Clayton Christensen, Bob Moest, if we don't get that point. But every company loves their own solution. We do too. But so we should keep that in mind. And what really is the customer trying to accomplish? And if ODI and jobs to be done is not it, we should sort of keep an open mind about that. And anyway, that was my summary of our conversation, which we titled, five guys obsessing about language. You guys have anything else to add before we wrap up? I can see we didn't keep to our time, but it was too fun.
Yeah. Send us an outcome statement on LinkedIn, and we will all respond to it.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, reach out to NUS LinkedIn. Reach out to Eric. As you can see, Eric is incredibly thoughtful. And by all means, read everything Lance Bettencourt has written. I have, and I tell everybody that has any interest in this to do the same. Yeah. All right, very good. Well, I can see this was awesome. So that, friends, concludes today's Product Quest podcast. Follow us on LinkedIn. Reach out to us at productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll see you next time. All right, my friends, it's lunchtime for Scotty.
Gotta go.
See you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Bye.